This row is for families. 11 years, and I can still hear the exact pitch of it. Not shouted, not even unkind to a stranger's ear. Just a man's voice, pleasant and certain, pitched to carry 3 seats along a row of red velvet chairs in a hall that smelled of floor polish and rain-damp wool. Lieutenant Merck Solt of the Coldwater Company, one hand resting on the back of the chair in front of him, leaning in with the easy patience of a man explaining something obvious to somebody slow. "This row is for families," he said again. "The staff and detail wait in the corridor. There's tea." My father was sitting in seat 4, row A, of the commissioning hall of the Crown Naval College at Saltmarch. He was in the full scarlet of the King's household guard, tunic buttoned to the throat, white gloves folded in his lap, bearskin resting on his knee like a sleeping animal. He had driven 200 miles that morning from the palace, straight off the King's Guard mount, because there had been no time to change, and because the invitation card had said, in small engraved letters, "Service dress is welcomed **." He was my father. It was my graduation. There was an empty chair beside him because my mother had been dead 4 years and nobody had thought to take her seat away. And I sat 6 rows back, in cadet blue with the whole hall in front of me, and I did not say one word. That is the story. Everything else, the 6 men who came in through the west door at the 3rd hour, the princess who stepped down from the dais, the commandant's voice cracking across the hall like a hawser going tight, everything else is just the account of how the world corrected a wrong that I personally had committed. I want that clear before I start. People hear this story and they want to make it about Solt. Solt was a stranger. Strangers can be forgiven for not knowing what a man is worth. I knew. The morning began well, which is how these things always begin. Saltmarch in the last week of spring is gray and salted and bright, gulls turning above the college's slate roofs, the estuary flat as poured tin beyond the seawall. Commissioning day. 211 of us in the passing out class, and by evening we would each have a sealed commission in a leather tube and a berth in the fleet, and the ones who were lucky would have something more than that. Because the Coldwater Company had sent a delegation. You have to understand what that meant to 22-year-old men. The Coldwater Company is the Crown's Naval Commando Corps, the men who go into the water at night with nothing, who hold the black shore and the burning deck, who wear the slate-gray beret with the little silver storm petrel on the badge. Nobody joins them. You are looked at. Somebody who has already done it decides whether you are worth the cost of trying, and if you are, your name goes onto a list of 11, and of the 11, 6 are put forward for selection. And of the 6, in a normal year, 1 or 2 come out the far end with the beret. They do not advertise. They do not recruit. They watch. And that day, 2 of them were sitting in row A of my graduation hall with a folded list, deciding. Lieutenant Merck Solt was 31, and had the trick some men have of making a room rearrange itself around him without appearing to ask. He came from a naval family. His grandfather had been an admiral of the 2nd rank. There was a portrait of the man in the college's long gallery, and Solt had walked past it that morning without a glance, which is its own kind of showing off. He was not a fool and he was not a coward. He had done everything the beret demanded and he had done it well. What he had instead of those faults was a total and comfortable certainty about the value of other men. A scale, running from us at the top down through the ordinary fleet, the ordinary army, the ordinary world, down at the bottom to the things that only look like soldiers. Chief Petty Officer Aldo Wren was the 2nd of them. 51, a face like a cliff that had been rained on for a long time, hands that had clearly closed around a great many ropes. He said almost nothing all day. That mattered later. They arrived at 9:45 and were shown to row A because Solt asked a 19-year-old steward where the delegation sat. And the steward, who did not know and who was afraid of the beret like everybody else, said "The front, sir," and got out of the way. Row A was not the delegations. Row A was the families. Every seat in that hall had a printed card and a brass clip on the back. The graduate's name, the guest's name, the seat. My father's card said Brackley. So did the one beside it, the one nobody would be sitting in, because Ilse Brackley had died 4 years before in a ward 6 streets from where I now sat, and my father had never once suggested we stop putting her name down for things. Solt turned the cards face down. I know because I found them afterwards at the end of everything when the hall was empty and I was on my knees in the aisle with my new commission in my fist. He hadn't torn them. He hadn't thrown them away. He had simply turned them over, the way you'd turn a photograph of somebody you didn't want looking at you, and sat down in the seat that had a dead woman's name on the back of it and made himself comfortable. The first thing was in the corridor, and I saw all of it. I had come out of the muster room to find my father because he had texted me, "Arrived, west door, don't rush." And I found him standing under the long gallery windows with his bearskin in the crook of his arm, looking up at a painting of a frigate in a following sea. He looked, in that corridor of navy blue and gold braid, like something from a different century that had walked in by mistake. Scarlet is a shout of a color. Among all that dark cloth it burned. And he looked wonderful. I want to be honest about that too, because it would be easier to tell you he looked ridiculous and that I was a boy with an understandable weakness. He didn't. He was 54, 6'2", and there was not a crease in him anywhere. The pleats on his tunic were like the edges of paper. His boots gave back the window. Sergeant Major Edric Brackley, 31 years in the King's Household Guard. Senior warrant officer of the 1st Company, which is a way of saying that when 400 men stand on a wet forecourt for 4 hours in front of the whole realm, he is the reason not one of them moves. I got about 10 feet from him. Then Solt and Wren came around the corner with their caps in their hands and their coats over their arms, and Solt saw the scarlet, and something happened in his face that I have thought about for 11 years. It wasn't malice. It was a kind of relief. He had found the category. "You," he said, walking straight up, not rudely, cheerfully. "Where do we drop these?" And he held out his cap. The corridor was full. Cadets, families, a knot of instructors by the door. Everybody heard it and everybody understood it, and the small sound that went through that corridor was not laughter, but something worse. The noise of a lot of people deciding at the same instant not to be involved. My father looked at the cap. He is not a slow man. He is the fastest man in a crisis I have ever known, and I have since served with people who are paid to be fast. But he took his time here. He looked at the cap, and then he looked at Solt, and there was a moment, a half-second, no more, when I saw my father calculate the entire day and arrive at his answer. He took the cap. He turned and he walked 4 steps to the mahogany rack under the frigate painting, and he hung the cap on a peg with the care of a man handling something that mattered. He came back. He said, "The rack is here, sir." His voice was perfectly level. Then, because Wren was still holding his own cap and had gone rather still, "And here, sir, there's a shelf beneath for coats." "Good man," said Solt, and clapped him once on the arm of the tunic, on the wool that 4 generations of that regiment have died in, and walked past him into the hall. Wren didn't move. He stood there with his cap in his hand and looked at my father for perhaps 2 seconds. Then he hung it up himself and went after his lieutenant. And I stood 10 feet away in cadet blue with my mouth shut. My father turned and saw me, and he smiled a small, dry, private smile, the one he keeps for absurdities, for burst pipes and lost keys and rain on parade days. "Davin," he said, "you've grown into that jacket." I said, "Dad." "Don't," he said pleasantly. "It's nothing, it's a hat on a peg. Where am I sitting?" That was my chance. That was the first of my chances, and it lasted about 4 seconds, and I let it go past me like a train I hadn't intended to catch. "Row A," I said, "seat 4. "Then I'll go and sit in it," he said, "and you'll go and get in line, and afterwards we will find somewhere in this town that does a decent pie." He put his glove flat against my chest for a second over the college crest. "Straighten that. You're an officer in 90 minutes. I need to tell you one more thing before I take you into the hall, and then I'll stop stalling, because I have noticed that I always stall here. When I was 9 years old, my father came to a school assembly in the Scarlet. He had been on duty. It was the same story as Saltmarch, 12 years earlier and in miniature. A state welcome that ran long, a drive across the county, no time to change. He came in through the back of the school hall with his bearskin under his arm and stood at the side because all the chairs were taken, and I looked up from the third row and saw him, and my whole chest went hot with a feeling I did not have a name for yet. He was the most magnificent thing in that room. He was also the only father in it wearing fur. The boys were merciless in the small, patient way boys are. It ran for 2 years. "Doorman, beefeater. Is your dad the king's teddy bear?" Somebody drew a picture of a bear in a red coat and put it in my desk, and I laughed at it, because that is what you do at 9. You laugh with them and you go home and you are sick in the downstairs lavatory where nobody can hear you. And when I was 11, before the school prize giving, I asked my father not to come in the uniform. I remember exactly how I said it. I had rehearsed. I said, "Dad, it's not a parade, you know. It's just a school thing, maybe just a coat." And my mother went very still at the sink and did not turn round. And my father said, "Course. Coat it is." And he came in a gray coat and a tie, and he sat in the 4th row, and he clapped when they gave me my certificate for arithmetic, and he never mentioned it again. Not once. Not in 11 years. Not when I told him I was going to the Naval College and he shook my hand so hard the bones went. Not ever. That is the thing I would like you to hold on to. He did not punish me for it. He did not use it. He simply put it down somewhere, the way he put the lieutenant's cap on the peg with care, and went on. The commissioning hall at Saltmarch seats about 600. High windows down the seaward side, the light coming off the estuary and moving on the ceiling. A dais at the far end with the college arms behind it, the roll of the lost in gold on the paneling. Every man and woman of the college drowned or fallen since its founding. Rows of gilt chairs. A marshal's table by the doors with the registrar behind it. An old woman named Perrin who had been there so long that half the flag officers in the realm had once been terrified of her. And on the dais, in a plain dark coat, the college's patron, the Princess Adela. The king's sister, not the king himself, and not the sort of royal who arrives with photographers. She had been patron of that college for 22 years, and she had buried in that time a considerable number of its graduates, and she read the roll of the lost aloud every commissioning day herself, all of it, without hurrying, and she never once looked at her cards while she did it. She was going to hand each of us our commission. She was going to shake 211 hands. We filed in at 10. I found my seat in the cadet blocks, 6 rows back and to the left, with a clean view down the aisle to row A. My father was in seat 4, exactly where I had put him, his bearskin on his knee, his gloves folded, his back a straight line. Beside him, an empty chair with a face-down card. Beside the empty chair, Lieutenant Merckxolt sat down, opened a leather folder, and started to read a list of 11 names. Mine was on it. And then he glanced sideways at the man in the red tunic, and I watched him work it out, the way you watch a wave come in, knowing the whole shape of it before it lands, and I saw him lean over, pleasant as anything, and say the sentence I have been carrying ever since. "This row is for families." My father did not answer at once. From 6 rows back I could see the side of his face, and nothing in it changed. He turned his head slowly, the way he turns his head on the forecourt, which is to say not really at all, just enough, and he looked at Lieutenant Solt. "I am family, sir," he said. The hall was filling. Around us, 600 people were finding seats and folding coats and telling each other to sit down, and in that noise you would not have heard a thing unless you were watching for it, and I was watching for it, and so were the 11 or 12 people nearest to row A. Salt smiled. It was, I have to say, a good smile. "Of course you are," he said, "but we've a hall full of mothers standing at the back, and I'm told there's a detail room with a kettle. You'll be more comfortable. It's a long ceremony." "There is no detail here, sir," my father said. "I'm not on duty. My son is graduating." And Salt laughed. It was a short laugh, and it was not cruel, and that is exactly why it was the worst sound in the whole hall. It was the laugh of a man who has been told a small, harmless, obvious lie by a person too far beneath him to be worth correcting properly. It was the laugh you give a man in a hired costume who tells you he owns the theater. "Right," Salt said, still smiling. "Sergeant, I'm going to be straight with you because I think you'll take it well." He half turned in his seat. "There's a Coldwater delegation in this hall today. We are here to look at these young men and choose which of them we spend the Crown's money on. There are 200 families out there hoping, and I do not particularly want the front row of the Crown Naval College's commissioning hall to look like a costume parade." He tapped the arm of my father's chair, twice, friendly. "Take the hat and go and have a cup of tea. Nobody thinks less of you." The empty chair between them, with my mother's name lying face down on the back of it. My father sat there for about 3 seconds. I've replayed those 3 seconds more times than any other 3 seconds of my life, and I know now, I did not know then, what was happening inside them. He was not deciding whether to obey. He had no intention of obeying, and he would not have obeyed a flag officer of the fleet in that hall on that day. He was deciding something else. He was deciding whether he was going to have an argument in the front row of his son's graduation. Because whatever else that day was going to be, it was going to be mine. And the whole of him, the entire man, the 31 years, is contained in the fact that he worked out in 3 seconds, that there was no version of that argument that ended with me having a good day. If he stayed, Salt would keep at it quietly all morning, and I would sit 6 rows back and watch. If he made his rank plain, there would be a scene, and the scene would be about him, and 600 people would spend the afternoon looking at the cadet whose father had made a scene. If he sent for the commandant, the ceremony would stop, and it would stop on my morning. There was exactly one move on that board that cost nobody but him. So he stood up. He stood up the way he does everything, which is to say without noise and without haste. He drew on his white gloves, because a guardsman does not carry his gloves through a public room. He took the bearskin under his left arm. He edged out along the row and said, "Excuse me, madam," to a woman in a green hat, and he walked up the aisle with that long, even, unhurried stride I would know at 1,000 yards in the dark. He did not look at me. He walked to the back of the hall, to the paneled wall beneath the Roll of the Lost, where there were no chairs. He stopped. He turned about, facing the dais. He put his heels together. And he stood there. The ceremony ran 2 hours and 40 minutes. Sit with that, because when I tell this to men who have never stood a post, they don't hear it. They hear he stood at the back, and they picture a man leaning on a wall with his arms folded, shifting his weight, checking his watch. He stood at attention. Heels together, bearskin under the left arm, the crown of it level, right hand flat along the seam of his trousers, chin up, eyes forward, that dead straight line from the back of the skull down through the heels that takes 10 years to learn and the rest of a life to keep. He did not lean. He did not fold his arms. He did not set the bearskin down, and it weighs the better part of a stone, and by the end of the 2nd hour the tendons of his left forearm must have been on fire. He did not move for 2 hours and 40 minutes at the back of a hall, at his only child's graduation, in the King's Scarlet, because a man he had never met had told him to get out of the family seats, and he had decided that the alternative would spoil my morning. You could see him from anywhere in that room. That is the thing about the color. He was one man against dark paneling, and he was the brightest object in a hall of 600, and every person in it could see him, and by the end of the first hour every person in it had worked out exactly what had happened. That is the part that isn't in the accounts. The hall knew. The hall knew by 10:30. And the hall, being 600 decent, ordinary, embarrassed people who did not want to make trouble at their sons' graduations, did what halls do. It looked away. They read the roll of the lost first. Princess Adela came to the lectern and read it, all of it, 416 names in a plain, unhurried voice, and the hall stood for it, and my father at the back was already standing, and so he simply went on standing. Then the addresses, then the prizes, the navigation prize, the seamanship prize, the sword for the head of the year. Applause, sit, applause, sit. Somewhere in the second hour, a boy 2 seats along from me leaned over and said out of the side of his mouth, "Is he actually going to stand there the whole time?" And somebody behind him said, "They wind them up at the factory, cheap batteries." And there was laughing, not much, 6 or 8 of them, the low, shoulder-shaking, hand-over-the-mouth laughing of young men in a room where they are not supposed to laugh. And I laughed. I want to be precise here, because I have spent 11 years being precise about it. It was not a real laugh. It was about half a breath. It was the reflex of a boy who wants very badly to be on the inside of a room, and it came out of me before I had decided anything at all, and it was finished in a quarter of a second, and nobody heard it. It is the worst thing I have ever done. Ivocel was sitting on my right. He had been my roommate for 3 years, a great gangling optimist from the northern fisheries, who had never in his life understood why anybody would keep quiet about anything. Kel did not laugh. Kel went red to the ears, put his hands on his knees, and began to stand up. "Sit down," I said. "Dav. Sit *down. That's your father *. I said sit down. And he looked at me. He looked at me for a good 2 seconds with his mouth slightly open, and then he sat, and he did not speak to me again for the rest of the ceremony, and he was the second person that morning whom I taught something about myself that I would rather he had not learned. Twice the hall tried. The first time was in the middle of the addresses. A grandmother in the 3rd row, a small woman in a purple coat, somebody's grandmother, I never found out whose, got out of her seat and went back up the aisle with the shuffling determination of the very old, and stood in front of my father and offered him her chair. I could not hear what she said. I could see her hands doing the offering. And my father inclined his head to her, that was all, the smallest bend of the neck about an inch, and said something, and she stood there a moment longer, and then she went back to her seat and sat down and did not look at the dais again for 20 minutes. She told me afterwards in the crush outside, gripping my sleeve, what he had said. He had said, "I'm on duty, madam." He was not on duty. He was a guest at a graduation, off the roster, out of his own time, with a bearskin under his arm and no post to hold, and no order in the world compelling him to stand there for 1 more second. He said it because it was the only sentence available that would let a kind old woman go and sit down, without feeling that she had failed him. The second time, a steward came. Somebody on the college staff had a rush of decency and sent a boy up the side aisle with a folding chair from the storeroom, and he set it down at the back wall next to my father with the little apologetic flourish of a 19-year-old, doing something that he suspects is above his pay. My father looked at the chair. He said, "Thank you. Leave it there, please." And the chair stood beside him empty for the rest of the ceremony, and he never touched it, and the sight of it, that plain wooden folding chair, standing at attention next to him, unused, was somehow worse than if there had been no chair at all. And then the phones came up. 4 or 5 of them in the middle rows, held low and turned sideways, because there is always somebody. A young man filming a guardsman standing at the back of a hall in full scarlet, filming him because he was odd, filming him because he was *funny*. Somewhere on the network that day, There is footage of my father from behind and to the left, and 11 years later I still cannot make myself look for it. And in row A, Lieutenant Merck Solt turned to the man beside him, a fleet officer he had known 10 minutes, and said something out of the corner of his mouth, and the man laughed. I did not hear it. I have never known what it was. But I saw the row laugh, and I saw my father's chin stay exactly where it was, and I understood, sitting there in my gilt chair with my hands flat on my thighs, that he was going to stand there and take all of it, all afternoon, and that nothing in the world was going to stop it except me. And I did nothing. Here is what I was protecting. I want it on the record so it can be weighed properly. 11 names on Solt's list. 6 would go forward to Coldwater selection. Selection lasts 9 weeks, and it is the hardest thing the Crown asks of anybody. And I had wanted it since I was 15 with the ferocity of a boy who has decided, without ever saying it out loud, that he is going to be a different kind of man from his father. Not a better man. I never thought that, and I am not going to make myself a monster in order to be honest. I did not think Coldwater men were better than Guardsmen. I thought they were ****. That is the whole of it. That is the entire shabby engine of it. I had spent my childhood watching my father be looked at and not seen, photographed 40,000 times a year by people who thought he was furniture, prodded and shouted at, and mimicked by men who wanted to make the statue blink, described in my own playground as a doorman, and somewhere in there, I had decided that I was going to serve in a way that could not be mistaken for scenery. And now there was a man in row A with a folded list and a slate-gray beret in his coat pocket, and the price of my name staying on that list appeared to be that I say nothing. So I said nothing. For 2 hours and 40 minutes I sat in a gilt chair with my hands flat on my thighs and looked at the dais and did not turn my head, and I told myself I was doing what he would want. That was the lie I used. I have used a good many lies since, and that one was the best made of all of them. He'd want me to keep my seat. He'd want me on that list. He'd want the day to go smoothly. And the terrible part, the part that keeps me awake in certain months, is that it was true ***. He would have wanted all of it. He would have told me to sit still and take the list and let him stand. It was true, and it was still a lie, because I was not doing it for him. There is a custom in the king's household guard, and my father told me about it once, when I was 17 in the car, on the way back from somewhere. He told it badly, because he told all his stories badly, in pieces, with the important part left out until you asked. There was a guardsman, a long time ago, whose wife had died. His daughter was passing out of a nursing college in the north, and there was nobody to sit with him, and he was a proud man and had told no one, and he went to the hall alone. And on the morning of the ceremony, 6 men of his section, who were not invited, and who had been told very plainly not to come, got on a night train and traveled in their own time, and walked into the back of that hall, and stood along the wall behind him in scarlet, and did not sit down, and did not say one word, and stayed there until the last name was read. They call it the standing. It is in no regulation. You will not find it in the customs of the service. It is a thing the regiment does for its own, and the point of it, this is the part he only told me because I asked twice. The point of it is not that the man is honored. The point, he said, watching the road, is that he isn't alone in the room. That's all it is, Davin. A man shouldn't be alone in a room on a day like that, so we go and stand in it with him. And I said at 17, with the vast idiot wisdom of 17, bit much though, isn't it? 6 blokes just standing there. And my father, who never in his life corrected me sharply about anything, said, "It's not much, it's the least there is." The interval came at 12:30. 20 minutes, tea in the long gallery, and then back in for the commissioning itself. 600 people got up and stretched and went out through the west door, and my father stayed where he was, because the wall he was standing against was beside that door, and the whole hall had to file past him to leave. I have never seen anything like it, and I never expect to again. 200 families coming down that aisle in twos and threes, and every one of them going quiet as they came level with him. Not looking, going quiet. A woman took her small daughter's hand and moved her to the far side of the aisle, the way you'd steer a child around a thing you couldn't explain. An old man in a fisherman's suit slowed right down and stopped and stood in front of my father for a second and lifted his hat to him and put it back on and walked out without a word. My father's eyes did not move. He gave the old man nothing. There was nothing to give. He was at attention, and a man at attention does not accept a courtesy, because to accept it he would have to break, and if he breaks, he is only a man in a red coat leaning on a wall. I went towards him. I want that written down too, because it is the only decent thing I did before the very end, and it lasted about 11 feet. I got up out of my row and I went down the side aisle towards the back wall with my throat closing and no idea at all what I was going to say. And I was perhaps 20 feet away when a hand landed on my shoulder from behind and turned me, gently and completely, in the other direction. "Brackley," said Lieutenant Salt. "Walk with me." He walked me out through the west door and along the gallery past the frigate in the following sea, past his grandfather in oils with his hand between my shoulder blades. He got 2 cups of tea. He gave me one. He was perfectly pleasant. "You're on the 6, he said. I remember the cup was too hot to hold properly, and I held it anyway. "Sir," I said. "Marks are good, not the best in the year. Kells are better." He blew on his tea. "You're on the 6 and Kell isn't, and I'll tell you why, because you'll be a better officer for hearing it." He turned round and leaned against the gallery rail and looked at me, and it was the first time all day that he had looked at anybody properly, and I understood, in a cold, slow way, that Lieutenant Merck Solt was not a stupid man at all. "The cards on the chairs," he said. "In row A, did you see them?" The gallery went a long way off. "Sir," I said. "Brackley," said Solt. "2 of them side by side, seat 4 and seat 5. He drank his tea. "I don't sit down in a room without reading it, Mr. Brackley. It's rather the point of me." I could not feel my hands. "You knew," I said. Of course I knew. He said it without any relish at all, which was the horror of it. He was not gloating. He was teaching. I had a hall full of candidates and a list of 11 names and about 3 hours to find out which of them keeps his head when something goes wrong in front of an audience. He shrugged. "So something went wrong in front of an audience." "That's my father *. "Yes," said Solt, "and a very fine ornament he is." He put the cup down on the rail. "Listen to me, because this is the only useful thing anyone will say to you today. In 9 weeks' time you may be lying in the surf at 3 in the morning with a section behind you and something on the beach that has gone badly wrong, and the only question that will matter, the only one, is whether you can stand there and take it and keep your mouth shut and not make it about you." He tapped the rail. "You did that. You did it for 2 hours in front of 600 people while your own father was made to look a fool. Kell would have been on his feet in 10 seconds and got himself thrown out of his own graduation and felt marvelous about it. Kell will be a very popular officer, and I would not have him on my beach for anything." He picked up his cup again. "That," he said, "is why you're on the 6. And I stood in that gallery, 22 years old, holding a cup of tea I could not drink, and I understood 2 things at the same time, which is one more than most men can bear at once. The first was that he was not entirely wrong. There is a truth in what he said. I have used that truth since I have needed it. The second was that he had taken the best thing in me and the worst thing in me, and he could not tell them apart, and neither could I. I said, "Thank you, sir." That is what I said, "Thank you, sir." It was Chief Petty Officer Wren who found the cord. He had gone back into the hall during the interval. I only learned this afterwards from Kell, who saw it, and later from Wren himself, who told me at some length and did not spare himself in the telling. He went back in for his folder, and he came up the aisle, and he passed within 4 feet of my father standing at the wall. And he stopped. Wren was 51 years old and had been in the fleet since he was 16, and there was very little cloth in the service that he could not read. He looked at the scarlet. He looked at the row of ribbons, the long service, the flood service in the lowlands, the sovereign's commendation, and then he looked at the left shoulder of the tunic, where there was a plaited silver cord, 3 strands, ending in 2 small tags of gray metal. He came back out to the gallery, and he stood in front of Solt, and he said quietly, "Sir, the guardsman, he's wearing a bearer's cord." "He's wearing a lot of things," said Solt. "Sir," Wren had his cap in his hands and he was turning it round and round. 12 men in the realm wear that cord, 12. They're the ones that carried the late queen. He swallowed. And the tags, the gray tags on it, that's the vigil. That's the men who stood at the head of her 3 days and 3 nights in the Hall of Light. There's not 12 of asterisk them, sir. There's 4. Solt considered this for perhaps 2 seconds. "Then he's had a busy funeral," he said, and went back into the hall. And Chief Petty Officer Aldo Wren stood in the long gallery of the Crown Naval College with his cap in his hands and his ears going slowly red. And then he went back into the commissioning hall, and he did not return to row A. He walked to the back of the hall, to the paneling under the Roll of the Lost, and he took up a position about 20 feet from my father, not beside him. He told me later that he did not consider himself entitled to stand beside him, and he stood there, at attention, in his own uniform, for the remaining hour and 10 minutes of the ceremony. He never said a word about it. He never so much as glanced across. He simply stood. And it changed nothing, and it changed everything, because for the last hour of my graduation there were 2 men standing at the back of that hall instead of 1, and you cannot make a joke about 2. There is one more thing I did during that interval, and it is the thing I have never been able to get all the way clean of. Every officer of the Crown Naval College is dressed at his commissioning. It is a small ceremony inside the large one. You go up when they call you, and Princess Adela hands you the leather tube with your commission in it, and then you turn and face the hall, and the person you have nominated comes up from the floor and pins your shoulder boards on. A father, a mother, a grandfather, an uncle, an old chief who taught you knots, somebody who has served if you have one, anybody you love if you haven't. If you name nobody, the commandant does it, and nobody thinks anything of it, because there are boys in every year who have no one. You put the name down 6 weeks in advance, on the marshal's list, at the table by the doors. 6 weeks before, on a wet Tuesday in the registrar's office with a bad pen, I had written SGT Maj E. Brackley, King's Household Guard, Father. I had written it, and then I had sat looking at it for a while, and I had felt, I am going to say this, because if I don't say it the whole account is worthless. I had felt a small, mean flicker of embarrassment, and then I had felt ashamed of the flicker, and then I had gone off to dinner and forgotten both. At 21 minutes past 12, in the interval of my graduation, I walked to the marshal's table by the west door and asked Mistress Perrin for the list. Mistress Perrin was about 70 and had run that table since before my father enlisted. She wore half-glasses on a chain and had the flat, unbothered eyes of a woman who has watched 40 years of young men be brave and stupid in roughly equal measure. She turned the ledger round to face me. "Cadet Brackley," she said, "you've a name down." "I want it struck out, ma'am." She did not move. Behind me, 30 yards away, at the back wall of the hall, my father was standing at attention with a bearskin under his arm. "Struck out," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." "And who will dress you, Mr. Brackley?" "The commandant, ma'am." Mistress Perrin looked at me over her half-glasses for a long moment. Then she looked past my shoulder. She looked past my shoulder, down the length of that hall, at the man standing under the roll of the lost, and she looked back at me. She said nothing at all. That was the worst of it. If she had said one word, I could have argued with it. And if I could have argued with it, I might have lost the argument. And if I had lost the argument, I would have been saved. She turned the ledger back round. She dipped her pen. She drew a single line slowly through asterisk SGT Major Edric Brackley, King's Household Guard, Father asterisk, and I watched the ink go on, and I felt nothing at all except a kind of numb relief, which is the feeling that ought to have frightened me most. Then she said, "In your own hand, please." And she turned the ledger round again and gave me the pen. I wrote asterisk none in the space beside my name. My handwriting was very steady. I have looked at that ledger since. They keep them, all of them, going back 140 years, in a cabinet in the registrar's office, and Mistress Perrin let me look at it 11 years later, and she stood beside me while I did, and my handwriting on that line is the neatest it has ever been in my life. Then I went back to my seat, and the hall filled up around me, and I sat down among 210 other young men in cadet blue with my hands flat on my thighs. And I felt fine. That is the confession. Not that I did it in a rage or in a panic or under some unbearable pressure that a person could sympathize with. I did it calmly, and afterwards I sat down and my pulse was normal and my hands were steady, and Lieutenant Soult caught my eye from row A and gave me a small nod, and I thought, there, it's done. It's all going to be fine now. That was the moment. If you want to know where the bottom of the day was, it was not the corridor, and it was not the order, and it was not my half-breath of laughter. It was the 4 minutes I spent sitting in a gilt chair, feeling asterisk fine asterisk. Because at the end of the 4 minutes, I made the mistake of looking up. My father was 30 yards behind me, and I had to turn to see him, and I had not turned once in 2 hours, and I do not know why I turned then. I have never known. He was looking at me. Not at the dais, not at the front, at me. He had broken his eyes front, the one thing that man does not break, the thing he had held through drunks and mockers and 40,000 cameras, and he was looking down the length of that hall at his son, and he had seen the marshal's table, and he had seen me lean over the ledger, and he had seen the pen change hands. He knew exactly what I had done. And there was no anger in his face. I would have given anything, then or since, for anger. There was nothing in it at all except a very great tiredness, and something else underneath the tiredness that I was too young and too far gone to name, and that I have spent 11 years trying to find a word for, and the only word I have ever been able to make fit is asterisk pity asterisk. He held my eyes for about a second and a half. Then he looked away to the front and put his chin up and went back to attention. And the west door of the commissioning hall opened. 2 weeks before commissioning day, I had come down to the kitchen at home for a glass of water and found my father standing at the counter in his shirt sleeves with the telephone against his ear. And he had said, in the flat voice he uses for orders, "Number out of the question." Pause. "Because I'm telling you not to, Color Sergeant. Because it's the boys' day and it isn't a parade, and I'll not have 6 men lose a Saturday standing about in a hall in the rain for me." Pause, and then quieter, almost amused, almost fond. "Nye, listen to me." He'd hate it. I had taken my water and gone back up to bed and thought nothing about it at all, because at 22, you assume every conversation your father has is about drains or duty rosters. He had told them not to come. He had told them not to come, and they had come anyway, because the standing is not the man's to refuse. It does not belong to him. It belongs to the regiment, and the regiment does not ask. They came in through the west door in single file, and they came in silence, and the sound they made was almost nothing at all, the small tap of a heel finding the floor, 6 times over in a hall of 600 people, and it went up the paneling and into the roof, and every head in that room turned. 6 men of the king's household guard. Full scarlet in the middle of a naval college in the middle of the afternoon. Bearskins on, chin straps down, white gloves, boots that had been done that morning by hand. Color Sergeant Nye at the head of them. I knew him. He had eaten at our table. He had taught me to swim in a cold river when I was 6, and behind him Corporal Den, and Tuck, and Ovid, and Pry, and Amory, who was 19 years old and had been in the regiment 11 months and had spent his own money on the train. They had come off the King's Guard mount at noon. They had changed nothing, because there was nothing to change. They had simply got into a coach and driven 200 miles in ceremonial order, in the heat, in the King's Scarlet, and they had been held 40 minutes at the Saltmarch Bridge by a lorry that had shed its load, which is why they were late, which is the only reason any of what follows happened at all. Nobody stopped them. There was a steward at the west door, and he did not stop them. I have often thought about what it would have taken to stop them, and I do not believe there was a man in that building who could have done it. They came up the side aisle, not the center. They would not walk down the center of another services hall. There are courtesies inside courtesies. And they came level with the paneling under the roll of the lost, and Color Sergeant Nye halted, and the 5 behind him halted, and the 6 of them turned all together to face the front of the hall. And then they went to their places. 3 of them to the left of my father, 3 of them to the right, not touching him, not looking at him, not looking at anything except the dais, 300 feet away over the heads of 600 people, with the flat forward stare that is the first thing that regiment teaches and the last thing it takes away. They dressed the line by eye. It took about a second and a half. When they had finished, the 7 of them stood along that wall in a rank so straight that you could have laid a string against it. And then, without a word, without a signal, I was watching. I have never stopped watching. All 6 of them reached up in the same instant and took off their bearskins and brought them down, and took them under the left arm, crown level, exactly as their sergeant major was holding his. 7 men. Same tunic, same gloves, same line, same fur under the same arm. No difference between them anywhere. You could not have told which of them was the man in trouble. That was the entire point, and it was made without one syllable being spoken, and it was the most eloquent thing I have ever seen a human being do. The hall stopped. Not politely, not gradually. 200 families and 211 cadets and a college staff and a princess of the realm. The entire room simply came to a halt, all at once, like an engine cutting out. The man at the lectern, who had been halfway through the list of academic honors, stopped talking and stood there with his mouth open and his hand on the page. And in that silence you could hear, quite clearly, a young woman near the front begin to cry. Lieutenant Merckx got to his feet. I have wondered for 11 years what he thought he was doing. I have decided in the end that he did not think anything. He had spent his whole adult life in an organization where a problem is walked at, and there was a problem at the back of the hall, and so he walked at it. He came out of row A and up the center aisle, and 600 people watched him do it, and every step he took was a step further into the worst decision of his life. He stopped in front of them. He stopped, specifically, in front of Color Sergeant Nye, because Nye was on the right of the line and had the badge of rank on his sleeve. "Color Sergeant," he said. "Nothing happened. I mean that precisely. Nothing happened." Nye's eyes did not move. Not a flicker, not a slide, not the smallest twitch of an eyelid. He was looking at the college arms above the dais, and he continued to look at the college arms above the dais, and there was, as far as any part of Color Sergeant Nye was concerned, no Lieutenant Merckx anywhere in the world. "Color Sergeant, I'm speaking to you." "Nothing. This is a Crown Naval College ceremony. You have no standing in this hall. You will take your men outside." "Nothing." And now Solt's voice went up. Not much, a quarter tone, but in that silence it was like a plate breaking. "I gave you an order." And still nothing. And I want you to understand what a truly terrible thing that is to be on the receiving end of, because I have seen strong men take a beating, and I have never seen anything strip a man the way that stripped him. There was no defiance in it. Defiance would have been a gift. Defiance is two men in a fight and both of them exist. This was 7 men in a straight line, at attention, in perfect order, in the uniform of the sovereign, looking through a Coldwater lieutenant as though he were a pane of glass. He was standing 18 inches from them, and he had ceased to be present in the room. He looked left along the rank. He looked right. 7 identical faces, none of them containing him. "I'll have your names," he said, and his voice was not steady, and everybody in that hall heard that it was not steady. Nobody gave him a name. He stood there for what the college afterwards agreed was about 11 seconds, in front of 600 people, waiting for one of 7 men to acknowledge that he was alive. None of them did. It was the commandant who ended it. Commandant Ivar Hask was 68 years old and had been running the Crown Naval College for 9 of them, and before that he had spent 26 years in the Coldwater Company, and he had a leg that had never worked properly since a night on a shingle beach that he did not discuss. He got up out of his chair on the dais with the help of his stick, and he came down the 3 steps at the front slowly, because he could not come down them any other way, and the entire hall waited for him to do it, and the tap of that stick on the boards is a sound I still hear. He came up the center aisle. He was a small man. He stopped beside Solt, and he did not look at him at first. He looked along the line of 7. Then he raised his stick and pointed, not at the guardsmen, but at Solt's feet, at the spot on the boards where the lieutenant was standing. "Do you know," he said, in a voice that reached the back of that hall without any apparent effort at all, "what it is you are standing in front of?" Solt said, "Sir, these men have no." "That was a question, Lieutenant." The silence went on a little. "No, sir," said Solt. "No," Hask agreed. "You don't." He turned round and faced the hall, 600 people, all of whom were now leaning forward, and he raised his voice slightly, the way a man raises it to be heard on a wet quarterdeck. "For the benefit of the hall," he said, "and for the benefit of any officer present who imagines that the customs of the service begin and end with his own cap badge, what you are looking at is a standing. It is a custom of the king's household guard. It has no regulation behind it and no authority behind it and no ceremony attached to it. It happens when a guardsman must sit alone in a hall on a day that matters. His section comes, uninvited in their own time at their own expense, and they stand at the back of the room with him, and they say nothing, and they ask for nothing, and they leave when it is over. It is not done to honor him. It is done so that he is not alone in the room. I have served 41 years, and I have seen it twice, and I would like the hall to understand that of all the things that will happen in this building today, every commission, every prize, every promise any of you will make that," and he pointed his stick, without turning round at the back wall, "is the most honorable thing in it." He let that stand for a moment. Then he said, "The hall will come to its feet." And 600 people stood up. Not a ripple, not a section here and a section there. The whole hall in one movement, chairs going back. The great soft roar of a room rising, families, staff, cadets, the flag officer in the second row, the woman in the green hat, Mistress Perrin at her table by the door, and Chief Petty Officer Aldo Wren was already standing, 20 feet down the wall, and had been for an hour and 10 minutes. 211 cadets came up out of their chairs. I came up with them. I want to be honest to the end. I did not stand because I chose to. I stood because everybody around me stood and my legs went with the room. And the 7 men at the back of the hall did not move, or nod, or look at anybody, or acknowledge in any way whatsoever that 600 people were on their feet in front of them, because they were at attention, and that is what it means. Commandant Hask turned back to Lieutenant Solt. He did not raise his voice for this part. He did not have to. There was no other sound in the building. "You will return to your seat," he said, "or you will leave my college. You have 30 seconds to decide, and I would think about it carefully, because whichever you choose, you and I will be having a conversation at 4 o'clock that I do not expect either of us to enjoy." And Merk Solt, who was not a coward, and who was, whatever else, a man capable of understanding exactly how much of his life had just been set on fire, turned around and walked back down the center aisle of the Crown Naval College commissioning hall, past 600 standing people, alone. He sat down in row A. He sat in seat 5, because that is where he had put himself, in the chair beside my father's, with my mother's name lying face down on the back of it. And I do not think he knew that. I have never told him. The hall was still on its feet, and nobody had told it to sit down, and for a moment nothing happened at all. Then the Princess Adela put down her cards. She had been standing at the lectern through the whole of it, quite motionless, one hand resting on the edge of the wood. She was 59 years old and had the sort of face that photographs badly and reads unmistakably in a room. She had said nothing during Hask's speech, and she said nothing now. She simply squared the little stack of cards, set them down on the lectern, stepped away from it, and came down off the dais. And she walked up the center aisle. 600 people, standing, and the king's sister walking the length of the hall between them with her hands loose at her sides, unhurried, in a plain dark coat, and every soul in that room turning to watch her go. She stopped in front of my father. I could not see his face from where I was. I have been told by Kell, by Wren, by 3 separate people who were closer, that it did not change. "Sergeant Major Brackley," she said. She said it clearly. She meant the hall to hear it. That was the first time in 11 weeks of build-up and 3 hours of ceremony that my father's name had been spoken aloud in that building, and it was spoken by the patron of the college in front of every person in it. Then she reached out. She did not touch him. She was careful, and indicated the plated silver cord on his left shoulder and the 2 gray tags that hung from it. "You carried my brother's queen," she said. The hall did not make a sound. 12 of you took her from the palace to the Hall of Light," Adela said. "I walked behind you, and when the doors were shut and the crowds had gone home and there was nobody left to see it, 4 of you stood the vigil at her head, 3 days and 3 nights, an hour on and an hour off, and you did not move, and you did not speak, and nobody photographed you, and nobody thanked you. And I do not believe anybody in this realm outside that hall knows your names." She paused. "I know your name," she said. "I have known it for 9 years." And she put out her hand. And my father could not take it. He was at attention. A man at attention has no hands. He has arms at his sides at the seams. He stood there with the king's sister's hand held out in front of him, and he could not move a muscle of himself to meet it, and the whole hall understood the trap he was in, and I have never in my life wanted so badly for a thing to be over. Princess Adela understood it faster than any of us. "Sergeant Major," she said, "I am not the hall. Stand at ease." And he stood at ease, and he took her hand. And 600 people started to applaud, and it went on for a very long time, and I stood in the middle of it in my cadet blues with my ears roaring and my commission not yet in my hands, and I could not clap, because if I had raised my hands I would have come apart in front of everybody. When it had died down, she said something else, and she said it quietly, but the hall had gone so still that it carried anyway. "There is a chair in the front row," she said, "with your name on the back of it. Will you come and sit in it?" And my father said, "No, ma'am, thank you." I heard that. Everyone heard it. She looked at him for a moment. "No. I started the day at this wall, ma'am," my father said. "I'll finish it here if it's all the same to you. I'm doing very well." I have thought about that answer more than almost anything else in this account, because it is the hinge of the entire man. He could have gone and sat in that chair. The room wanted him to. The room would have wept if he had. It would have been a triumph. It would have been the story everybody wanted, the one where the good man is lifted up and set in the best seat in the house while the bad man watches. And he would not have it, not because he was proud and not because he was making a point. He was, I am certain, entirely unaware of making any point at all. He would not have it because he had never in his life stood a post in order to be seen standing it. And if he had walked down that aisle and taken that chair in front of 600 applauding people, the 2 hours and 40 minutes would have turned, retrospectively, into a performance. He had not been performing, he had been standing. The distinction is the whole of my father, and it is the thing I have spent 11 years trying to learn, and I am not there yet. Princess Adela nodded slowly, and I am told she was very close to smiling. "Then I shall come to you," she said, "when it's needed." And she walked back up the aisle and got up onto the dais and picked up her cards and said, in a voice that had nothing whatever in it but business, "Marshal, call the divisions." They commission by division at Saltmarch. An estuary division is called last, and there were 51 of us in it, and my name is Brackley, and so I was third. 211 leather tubes. It takes an hour. You queue at the side of the dais and you go up when the marshal calls you, and you take your commission from the patron's hands, and you turn about and face the hall, and the marshal reads out the name of the person who will dress you, and they come up from the floor, and they pin your shoulder boards on in front of everybody, and then you both go down. I stood in that queue with my heart going like a hammer on a plate. I do not remember the 60 minutes. I remember individual seconds of them. I remember Kell going up 9 names before me, and his father, a fisherman with hands like tackle blocks, going up the steps in a suit that did not fit him and pinning his son's boards on with the tenderness of a man handling a bird's egg. And I remember standing in the queue watching that and thinking, quite clearly and calmly, I have done a thing that cannot be undone. And then the marshal said, "Estuary Division, Cadet Davin Brackley." I went up. Princess Adela put the leather tube in my hands, and she looked at me, properly, for perhaps 2 seconds, the way she had looked at my father, and I will go to my grave believing that she knew everything. I turned about and faced the hall. 600 people. And 30 yards down the center of them, at the back wall under the roll of the lost, 7 men in scarlet standing in a line, and my father the 4th from the left, eyes front. And behind me, Mistress Perrin at the marshal's table, read from her ledger in a flat, clear, carrying voice, exactly as it was written, because that was her office and she had never in 40 years done otherwise. Cadet Officer Brackley, dresser none. The word went out across that hall and hit the back wall and came back. None. I heard it land. I heard 200 families understand it. I heard, somewhere off to my left, a woman make a small sound. And Commandant Hask, who was sitting on the dais with his stick across his knees, began, because it was his duty, because that is what happens when a boy has nobody to get up out of his chair. And I said, "No, sir." I said it too loudly. My voice cracked on it. I said it to a room of 600 people with a leather tube in my hand and my ears burning and my whole life balanced on the next 30 seconds, and Hask stopped, half out of his chair, and looked at me. And I came down off the dais. I did not go to the side steps. I went straight down the front of it, and I turned, and I started to walk up the center aisle of the commissioning hall of the Crown Naval College at Saltmarch. It is 140 feet. I have measured it since. I went back and I measured it, years later on a wet Tuesday, with a tape, and it is 140 feet, and it is the longest distance I have ever covered in my life, including the 9 weeks that came afterwards and the 3 years after that, and I do not expect ever to walk anything longer. Nobody made a sound. I went past row after row of faces turning to follow me. I went past Kell, who was on his feet before I reached him. I went past the woman in the green hat. I went past row A, and I did not look at Lieutenant Merck Solt, and I have no idea to this day what was on his face, and I have never wanted to know. I went past Chief Petty Officer Wren, standing alone at his part of the wall, and he came to attention as I passed him, and I did not understand until much later that he was not doing it for me. And I stopped in front of my father. He was looking straight ahead, over my shoulder at the dais. Of course he was. He was at attention in a public hall, and I was a cadet officer of the fleet, and there was nothing on this earth that was going to move his eyes. I stood in front of him for a long time, long enough that people started to shift. Long enough that I understood he was going to give me nothing at all, not a nod, not a glance, not 1 inch of help, because he could not, and because I had not earned it, and because the last thing in the world he was going to do was make it easier for me to be a coward twice. I had to do it myself. It was the first thing I ever did. I got my heels together badly. My knees were not working properly, and I said, in a voice that I could hear breaking in the middle of it, in front of 600 people and the king's sister, and the man who held my career in a folded list. "Sergeant Major Brackley." "Nothing." "Sergeant Major Brackley," I said, "will you dress me, sir?" And my father's eyes came down off the dais and found mine. He said, "Color Sergeant." And Nye put out his left arm, and my father laid the bearskin across it without looking, and Nye took it and held it as though it were an infant. Then my father stepped out of the line. We walked back up that aisle together, the whole 140 feet, side by side, and I could not have told you at any point in it whether I was crying, and I have decided since that I probably was, and that it does not matter. They stood up as we passed. That is the part I did not expect. Row by row, as we came level, 600 people got out of their chairs, not applauding, not cheering, just rising, the way you rise for the roll of the lost. My father did not look at them. He walked up the center of that hall in his scarlet with his chin up and his eyes on the far wall, and there was not one thing in his bearing that was any different from the way he walks onto a forecourt at 6 in the morning to shout at 400 men about their boots. We went up the steps. Princess Adela moved back a pace and let us have the dais. He turned me round to face the hall, with 2 fingers on my elbow. He took the shoulder boards off the velvet cushion the marshal held, and he put them on me, one and then the other, with his white gloves, and his hands were completely steady, and mine were shaking so badly that the leather tube was rattling against my leg, and he did not comment on it, and he did not look at my face, because he was giving me the only privacy available to a man on a stage. He squared the left board with his thumb. He brushed the shoulder flat. Then he said quietly, so that only I could hear it, "Straighten that, you're an officer." And I made a noise that was not a word. "Not here," my father said, still working at the shoulder, still not looking up. "Chin up, eyes front. Hall's waiting." "Dad, I know." He stepped back and looked at me then once for about a second, and gave me the small, dry, private smile, the one for burst pipes and lost keys and rain on parade days. "Standing's the easy half, boy," he said. "You did the hard one just now." And he came to attention, and he saluted my commission, my father, 31 years in, saluting a 22-year-old cadet officer of 11 minutes standing, because that is what the rank on the paper requires, and he had never once in his life shaved a rule for his own comfort. And then he turned about and walked back down the aisle, and took his bearskin from Color Sergeant Nye, and returned to his place in the line, 4th from the left, and stood. And he stood there for the remaining 40 minutes, until the last name in Estuary Division had been read. The 6 of them left the moment it was over. No thanks, no photographs, no handshakes. Nye got them out through the west door before the hall had finished clapping, and they were on the coach and away up the Saltmarch road before I got outside. And Amory, 19 years old, 11 months in the regiment, who had paid for his own train ticket and never met me in his life, was back on the King's Gate at 6 the next morning. That is what a standing is. They come, they stand, they go home. The rest is bookkeeping, but it belongs to the story, so I will set it down. Commandant Hask held his 4 o'clock. Lieutenant Merck Solt was taken off the selection board that same afternoon and was formally answerable within the week for a breach of the customs of the service, which is not a dramatic charge and does not sound like much, and which every officer in the fleet understands to be one of the very few things from which a career does not simply recover. He would have been finished. The commandant intended it, and Princess Adela's silence on the matter was not the silence of a woman inclined to intervene. He was not finished, and the reason he was not finished is the last thing I have to tell you about my father, and it is the one that took me longest to forgive. 6 days after commissioning day, a letter went from the sergeant major's quarters at the palace to the office of the commandant of the Crown Naval College. I have read it. Hask kept it and showed it to me years afterwards, and it is 4 lines long. Sir, I understand there is a question over Lieutenant Solt. He was wrong, and he has been told so by 600 people, which is more than most men get. Take the board from him. He has no business choosing men. But do not take the sea from him. He is good at it, and the realm paid for him. E. Brackley, SGT Maj, King's Household Guard. Solt kept his commission. He never sat on a selection board again. He is a commander now in the Northern Squadron, and by every account a hard and effective one, and I have met him twice in 11 years, and both times he stopped what he was doing and stood up. He has never apologized to me. He apologized to my father in writing 3 weeks after, and my father read it once and put it in the drawer where he keeps the electricity bills and said, "Well, that's that," and went out to do the lawn. Chief Petty Officer Aldo Wren put 6 names forward to selection, and mine was on it, and he came and found me in the boat sheds on the last evening of that week to make quite sure I understood why. "Your marks," he said. "That's all, not your father, not the hall, your marks. If you go up that beach thinking you owe somebody a debt, you'll get men killed paying it." I said, "Yes, Chief." He looked at me for a while. Then he said, "I stood at that wall for an hour and 10 minutes, and my back hurt for a fortnight, and I was 20 feet away from him, and I had no right to be closer, and I've been in this service 35 years, son, and I have never been ashamed of a day the way I was ashamed of that one." He put his cap on. "So we're both carrying something. Carry it properly." I went to Coldwater selection 9 weeks later. My father drove me to the gate and shook my hand and said, "Eat when they let you," and drove away without looking back, and I did not see him again for 61 days. I passed. That is not the point of anything, and I mention it only because people always ask. Here is where it ends. On the morning after selection ended, I got a train south instead of a train home, and at 4 o'clock in the morning I was standing on the wet pavement outside the palace railings, in a naval greatcoat, with a beret in my pocket that I had not yet earned the right to be casual about. The guard mount was at 5. The scarlet came out of the arch and split, and the sentries went to their boxes, and one of them was my father, because I had checked the roster with Nye like a thief. He saw me. He did not react. He would not. So I found the place on the pavement directly opposite him, on the public side of the railings, 40 feet away across the cobbles, and I put my heels together, and I came to attention. And I stood there. I stood there for 2 hours and 40 minutes. I had worked it out on the train, 2 hours and 40 minutes, the exact length of the commissioning hall ceremony at Saltmarch, and I had decided, somewhere north of the river, that I was going to give it back to him, all of it to the minute, and that it would not make anything right, and that I was going to do it anyway. It rained not hard. The steady gray soaking rain of a city morning, and the water got into the collar of the greatcoat and down my back, and my left arm started to burn at around the 90-minute mark, and I thought about the bearskin, and how it weighs the better part of a stone, and I stood there. People photographed me. Tourists came out at 7 and photographed the guardsman in his box, and then noticed the young man in navy blue standing to attention on the wrong side of the railings in the rain, and photographed him too, and asked him what he was doing, and got no answer, and went away. And at about 7:15, an elderly man in a plain coat came out of a side door of the palace and walked the length of the forecourt on the gravel with his hands behind his back, the way men do when they cannot sleep, and stopped near the box, and looked out through the railings for quite a long time. King Alaric said something to my father. I could not hear it. I have never asked what the question was because I know what the question was. And my father answered him 3 words, without moving his eyes, in the voice he uses for orders and for the truth. My son, sir. And the king looked at me across 40 feet of wet cobblestones for a while longer. Then he said, in the mild, carrying voice of a man who has spent his life being overheard on purpose, "He stands well." And he went back inside. I found my mother's seat card afterwards, that day at Saltmarch, in the empty hall, face down under the chair where a man had turned it over so that a dead woman would not look at him. Brackley, in small engraved letters. It is in my kit now in the lid of it, and it has been in every kit I have carried for 11 years, and it goes wherever I go. People ask me about the Coldwater Company. They ask what it takes, and they want to hear about the water and the 9 weeks and the beach, and I tell them, and it is all true, and none of it is the answer. Because when they ask me who taught me to stand, and they always ask in the end, in a bar somewhere at 2 in the morning, when the young ones want the story, I do not say the Coldwater Company. I say, there was a man at the back of a hall in the King's Scarlet with a bearskin under his arm who was not allowed to sit with his own family. And he stood for 2 hours and 40 minutes, and he never moved, and he never spoke, and he never once asked anybody to notice. And 6 men in scarlet came in through a door and stood beside him. And that was all it took to silence a room of 600 people, 6 men, standing still, saying nothing. That is the whole of it. That is what the uniform is. I was 22 years late understanding it, and I understood it at last on a wet pavement, on the wrong side of the railings in the rain, watching my father not look at me.